Okay. Um, Good afternoon. My name is Evan Weiner, and I'm going to give you this one because we are in political season, and you've heard a lot about fake electors and corruption and stolen election. 1876. To this day, nobody knows who won that election. Was it Rutherford B. Hayes? Was it Samuel J. Tilden? Was there intimidation? Yes. Were there fake electors? They tried to have fake electors. Was there fooling around with votes? Yes. The fraudulent election of 1876, probably the dirtiest election in American history. And it was backroom deals that actually made Rutherford B. Hayes the President of the United States. The Democrats, Tilden or blood. Hey, you know what? The whole union may go if you allow the Democrats to take over. So it's 100th birthday of the United States, 1876, but it is not a happy birthday. The outgoing president, Ulysses S. Grant's second term, is a total disaster. The country is still trying to overcome the end of the Civil War, which happened just 11 years earlier. The solid popular majority, including ex-slaves in the South, protected by the actual or threatened presence of federal troops that had re-elected the Civil War hero Grant in 1872, had been weakened by a sustained economic depression, systematic corruption, and Southern white resistance and Northern white fatigue with Reconstruction. So if this was on cable TV news today in 2023, you would hear all kinds of, yes it is, no it's not, yes it is, no it's not. Oh, question. Who's buried in Grant's tomb?
Grant and his wife.
No, they're not buried there. They're in the mausoleum. There is nobody buried in Grant's tomb. Do you know that?
No.
No. How many of you remember You Bet Your Life with Groucho Marx? Right? Okay. When a contestant would bomb out, or contestants bomb out, now the duck would come down, that would be $100. But when the contestants bombed out and had no money, he asked two questions. One of them was, what is the color of George Washington's white horse? And the other was, who's buried in Grant's tomb? But he had a guest on one day said, no one.
Right.
What do you mean no one? Well, there is no tomb in there. It's a mausoleum. So there you go. So if anybody ever asks you a question, who's buried in Grant's tomb? It's nobody. Nobody. So happy anniversary, America. Hey, 100th anniversary. Something did happen in 1876, which was good. The first combustible engine was put together, which would eventually lead to the car. That happened in 1876. So it was widely assumed during the year of 1875 that Grant would run for a third term as president despite poor economic conditions. There was a depression in 1873. And he was also going to buck a trend. You know, George Washington did not want to serve two terms. He wanted to get out of there as soon as he could. But he was persuaded to serve a second term. And he decided, I'm not going to do a third term. And that was a tradition. You did not run for a third term for president because Washington didn't do it. But he was thinking about, hey, let's do a third term. Yeah, we have numerous political scandals. George Washington didn't want to do more than 2 terms. Grant's inner circle advised him, yeah, why don't you go ahead, do the third term. But on December 15th, 1875, the House of Representatives, by a 233-18 vote, passed a resolution declaring that the 2-term tradition was to prevent a dictatorship. And I got a side story about Grant here. You might be interested. I knew a guy by the name of Norman McLean. And Norman McLean's ancestor, Wilmer McLean, 1861, he owned the property over at Bull Run. That's where the Civil War started. And Wilmer, was trying to get away from the Civil War, and he ended up at Appomattox. The Civil War ended in the parlor room of Wilmer McLean. He's there at the start, he's there at the end. And Grant decided to steal as much as he could out of Wilmer McLean's house. Well, the McLean family forever has been fighting the U.S. government. The government says it's our property. And the McLeans say, no, it's our property. You stole it during the time that Grant and Lee came up, and when Lee surrendered. Most of this stuff that was in Wilmer McLean's house ended up in a Cleveland warehouse. As far as Wilmer McLean, most of his family fled to Nova Scotia because they were Southerners, but you probably haven't heard much about poor old Wilmer McLean, but anyway, and I knew Norman McLean, who was one of his relatives, who told me the story, then I looked it up. Happy birthday! And there's Ulysses S. Grant. Grant then said in 1876, look, I'm not going to run. He tried to get the Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, to run for presidency, but Fish was 67 years old, same age I am, and I can understand, hey, you know, you want to relax a little bit. You don't want to become the President of the United States. I'm too old for that role. But Grant didn't give up. He sent a letter to the Republican convention asking them to nominate Hamilton Fish. But somehow the letter gets lost and was never read to the delegates at the Republican convention. Maybe Fish actually got the letter and tore it up. So it's not so happy birthday America. By the way, if you wanted to celebrate the centennial in the United States in 1876, you ended up in Philadelphia. And that's where they had the big celebrations for the 100th anniversary of America. Well, following the Civil War, America is trying to stitch itself back together. And there was a trio of constitutional amendments that abolished slavery, made the former slave citizens, and gave all men, notice all men, the right to vote regardless of race. Women? Do you know that women in the 19th century had less rights than a man committed to an insane asylum?
Really?
Yeah, less rights than a man that was committed to an insane asylum. Women weren't allowed to vote. But the big question was, how do you disenfranchise voters? How do you stop voters? Because in the South, the Democrats certainly did not want the newly freed slaves, and they weren't so newly freed at that point, it was more than a decade. They did not want them to vote. Well, many states used poll taxes, literacy taxes, and other measures to keep their African American citizens essentially disenfranchised. Do you know that it was not until 1964 constitutional amendment that ended the poll tax on federal elections? 1964, in your lifetime, there was still a poll tax. They enforced strict segregation through Jim Crow laws and condoned violence from white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. So how do you stop the voters? How do you go about stopping the voters? Well, you can charge them for votes, but the better way was just kill the potential voters. And that's what happened, kill the voters. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 is notable as the last major piece of legislation related to Reconstruction that was passed by Congress during the Reconstruction era. These Civil Rights Acts included the Civil Rights Act of 1866, 4 Reconstruction Acts of 1867, 1869, 3 Enforcement Acts of 1870, 1871, and 3 constitutional amendments adopted between 1865 and 1870. Well, Grant is done, and so is Reconstruction. People got tired of the Reconstruction, especially people in the North who are looking, well, we just had a depression. Why are we sending money and troops down there? We need that for something else. So Grant starts taking the troops and bringing them out of the South. The 76 election occurred in the midst of an economic depression in the United States and continuing sectional animosity, particularly in the South, where opposition to federal occupation and Reconstruction had grown. Republicans continued their strong commitment to the civil rights of emancipated slaves. The Democratic platform called for immediate reform of the federal government and committed itself to the permanence of the federal union. It also called for civil service reform. And you know, you hear about immigration all the time, right? This is 2023, immigration, immigration, immigration. 1876, restrictions on Chinese immigration to the United States. Anybody watch Blazing Saddles, the movie? Yeah. There is a scene in Blazing Saddles where all these minorities are together and they're going to take over the town of Rockridge because the bad guys want it because of the railroad. And they talk about minorities and they go to the various minorities and they talk about, well, we won't take, we're not going to take this minority. And somebody says, well, if you don't take them, we're not doing it. So that was lampooned in 1974, nearly 100 years later, but they were talking about Chinese immigration. And by the way, who built the railroads in the United States? Chinese. I had a guy I knew, Robert Lee, who was from Halifax, passed away a couple of years ago. And he and a bunch of Chinese immigrants or descendants from Chinese immigrants were trying to sue the Canadian government because the Canadian government was trying to do the same, kick out Chinese immigrants, and they did. And his mother stayed in China and his father was here and he never saw his mother again. That's Samuel J. Tilden. He is the governor of New York and he is the Democratic nominee. And believe it or not, to this day, you use one of the things that he left his money for, but I'll tell you more at the end. Oh. Samuel Tilden was a successful lawyer and politician. He was a free soiler, but unlike other free soil Democrats in the 1850s, he did not join the new Republican Party and disapproved of the Civil War. Excuse me?
Free soiler.
Free soil. They were the ones against slavery. They were against slavery. As a state Democratic chairman after 1866, he sought reform and gathered much of the evidence of corruption that broke up the Bosch-Tweed ring in 1871 in New York City, Tammany Hall and Bosch-Tweed. Elected governor of New York in 1874, he continued building his reputation for reform by attacking and breaking the canal ring, individuals that made millions of dollars illegally from contracts for the repair and extension of the state's lucrative canals, including the Erie Canal. And that is Rutherford B. Hayes, who ended up being a Civil War general for the North. He was also a lawyer, fought for the Union side in the Civil War, wounded in action, rose to the rank of brevet major general. While he was still in the Army, Cincinnati Republicans ran him for the House of Representatives. He accepted the nomination but would not campaign, explaining an officer fit for duty who at this crisis would abandon his post to electioneer ought to be scalped. Scalp him. He enters Congress December 1865, but he's troubled. He's absolutely troubled because there are rebel influences ruling the White House. Between 1867 and 1876, he served 3 terms as governor of Ohio. Safe liberalism, party loyalty, and a good war record made Hayes an acceptable Republican candidate in 1876. Well, the campaign issues. What were the campaign issues? Let's strive for human rights is one of them. Preserve the nation's honor. But what are we going to do with the South? What are we going to do with the South? Tilden ran as a reform candidate against the background of corruption of the Grant administration. Both parties, they wanted civil service reform. Both sides mounted mudslinging campaigns with Democratic attacks on Republican corruption being countered by Republicans raising the Civil War issue, a tactic that was ridiculed by Democrats who called it waving the bloody shirt. Republicans chanted, not every Democrat was a rebel, but every rebel was a Democrat. The country is in turmoil. The economy suffering the panic of 1873. Racial tensions are very, very high following the Civil War. Hayes's Republican Party supported federal power and the rights of black citizens, while Tilden's Democratic Party wanted to limit rights for formerly enslaved people and let the South govern more independently, which means let's go back to where we were in the 1840s. Oh, what was not a campaign issue? Native Americans. Native Americans are being sent off to reservations in 1876. On January 31st, 1876, the Grant administration ordered for Native Americans to move to reservations. The hope of creating these reservations was to reduce clashes between white settlers and natives. The whites wanted the land. Whose land was it? It's Native American land. Actually, it wasn't. They never claimed land. They never claimed land. No property ownership. But they had their territories. At first, Native American tribes were given land that they could use for agriculture. Meanwhile, battles continued between Native Americans and the United States Army, with the most famous of 1876 being the Battle of Little Bighorn, and of course the end of General Custer. Well, here are the candidates. Could he be elected with that beard today?
Yes.
Yeah, you think he can? You don't think people would make fun of him? And there's Tilden, who's clean shaven. I don't know about that. I think that if he had a beard, that people would mock him. Hayes ran on a reform platform, promising to clean up the civil service. He was only going to serve one term. His opponent, Tilden, was known for challenging political corruption. But the party operatives, not these two guys were dull. The party operatives staged a cutthroat campaign. Hayes' enemies claimed he had stolen money from his brothers in arms, fellow soldiers during the Civil War. Tilden was a liar. He was a swindler. He was a perjurer. He was a counterfeiter. And even the absurd claim that he had been in league with the infamous Boss Tweed. In line with the basic campaign strategy, Republicans alleged that Tilden had supported the Confederacy, the right of secession, and the continuation of slavery. And this all stemmed from his opposition to Lincoln in 1860. But there was also, he was a Democrat, and he feared a Republican victory would be a disaster for the United States. Oh, there was one other thing that didn't really go all that well in 1876. Republicans also suggested that Tilden courted men to undermine him. Why was he a bachelor? You have to think about that one, don't you? Dirty deeds done dirt cheap. Dirty deeds. Racism remained a force in the North as well as the South, and by the early 1870s, many Northerners had begun blaming Reconstruction's problems on the supposed inferiority of black voters. Hey, black voters, they're stupid. They're really stupid, even though Frederick Douglass was around and others were around. At the same time, key decisions by the United States Supreme Court struck at the protections afforded by Reconstruction-era constitutional amendments and legislation. The court's 1873 decision in the Slaughterhouse cases established that the 14th Amendment applied only to former enslaved people and protected only the rights granted by the federal government, not the states. States' rights. It's back to where it was around 1859. And then there was the Mississippi Plan. Biloxi, Mississippi down there with me. The Mississippi Plan is the thing that begins to undo the Reconstruction era. The Mississippi Plan of 1875 saw the Democrats use paramilitary groups known as the Red Shirts in the white man's league to break up rallies that involved African Americans, bullying many of them voting, and even using pictures of Abraham Lincoln to confuse illiterate voters to accidentally vote for Democrats. And the plan succeeds. Now this is me in Columbia, South Carolina, and that is Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond literally blocked, or tried to block the 1957 Civil Rights Act. The funny thing about Strom Thurmond, who was the former governor and senator in South Carolina, he had two families. He had his white family, and he had his African-American family, thanks to his mistress. But he hid that. I'm going to tell you a story that Al Sharpton once told me about Strom Thurmond, who was a segregationist, ran as a Dixiecrat in 1948. Al Sharpton was James Brown's hairdresser. Remember James Brown? I feel good. Anyway, James Brown tells him, "You're going with me one day." And they're driving into Washington, and they drive into the parking lot near the Senate office. And Al's asking, "What's going on? What's going on? What's going on?" He said, "Just come with me." And James Brown goes through the Senate chambers and then goes to an office. And he rings the doorbell. And Al Sharpton looks at it, and says, "Senator Strom Thurmond. He's a segregationist, right?" And he says, they get Senator Strom Thurmond out, and there's James Brown, and they embrace. And Al Sharpton is in shock. And he said, they were best of friends. James Brown, you would never think that, but they were best friends. Anyway, the rifle clubs caused riots during Republican political rallies on a regular basis. Members of these clubs made sure black people were shot by the hundreds like livestock during these organized political demonstrations. Mississippi's white action spurred the rise of the red shirts in North Carolina and South Carolina as well. The Mississippi Plan was very successful in undermining the Republican-led government, and in 1875, the resurgent Democratic Party took control of the state legislature. In 1876, the Republican governor and lieutenant general were impeached. Why? Because we wanted to. And the Democrat, John M. Stone, became the new governor. White Democrats took control of the judicial branch of the government as well in 1876, and congressional reconstruction in Mississippi was all but finished. By the way, they don't want to teach you this in schools in the South. They don't want to teach you about leading up to the 1876 election. The other thing is, when we were in school, how much did we ever hear about the 1876 election? Virtually nothing. Virtually nothing. And yet, it's one of the 5 or 6 most important elections in American history. Dirty deeds, done dirt cheap. Well, she's not going to do it. Actually, I'm going to see her in 2 weeks. We just had a baby. So we're going to go out to Seattle and see her and the new baby. In the aftermath of the Democratic victory, conservative whites in Mississippi promoted a number of myths about Reconstruction to justify the takeover of the state government. Alternate set of facts, I think it's called today. Alternate set of facts. Black politicians were stereotyped as incompetent and ignorant, and claimed the Republican government was corrupt. The Mississippi Plan helped to create the optics of the failed policies of Reconstruction. And that is the Supreme Court of the United States, my wife in front of there, and they too had a hand in the 1870s and all the problems. In 1876, in the United States against Cruikshank, the Supreme Court ordered the conviction of 3 white men convicted in connection with a massacre of more than 100 black men in Colfax, Louisiana in 1873 as part of a political dispute. The men had been convicted of violating the 1870 Enforcement Act, which banned conspiracies to deny citizens constitutional rights and had been intended to combat violence by the Ku Klux Klan against black people in the South. Gee, conspiracies, where have I heard that lately? I swear I've heard that lately. The Supreme Court's ruling that the 14th Amendment's promise of due process and equal protection covered Violations of citizens' rights by the states, but not only by individuals, would make prosecuting anti-black violence increasingly difficult, even as the Klan and other white supremacist groups were helping to disenfranchise black voters and reassert white control of the South. Everybody knew that the 1876 election was going to be rough. Nationwide, partisan loyalties were tightened as Republicans and Democrats battled over black voting rights, the memory of the Civil War, and an awful depression. Each party held massive midnight rallies, and some leaders on both sides urged voters to come to the polls armed. Bring your guns. Bring your guns. Neither Rutherford B. Hayes nor Samuel J. Tilden were firebrands, and they were regarded as dull people. They were dull. It's a bottle of whiskey. Bottle of whiskey. Hayes is losing. So let's take that bottle of whiskey and use it tonight, maybe get hung over, and forget about the election of 1876. On election night, Hayes' hopes began to sink as swing states such as Connecticut, Indiana, and New Jersey went to Tilden. When New York finally fell into Tilden's camp, after all, he was the governor, Hayes admitted defeat to those around him and went to bed. Tilden was not only leading in the popular vote, he also had 184 of the electoral votes. He only needed 185 to win. So he needed one more vote to become president of the United States, while Hayes had to run the table with all the states that were out there, which were all in the South. Diane Sickles, a former Civil War general and a Republican politician, spent the evening calculating votes in the party's headquarters. Sickles realized that although the Democrats had won the popular vote, 20 electoral votes needed to win the presidency remained undecided. South Carolina, Florida. Gee, we heard Florida before in electoral counts and kind of mischief in Florida. Louisiana and Oregon might still give their votes to Hayes. Well, there is South Carolina again. Here stood the State House, built 1876 through 1790. James Horan is the architect. Burned by Sherman's troops, February 17, 1865. General Sherman burnt down the State House in South Carolina. The 19 votes, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, were not yet declared, but they were in the heartland of the Democratic South. And the Republican headquarters, exhausted and dispirited party workers began to go home to get that bottle of whiskey. Louisiana, Florida, South Carolina, well, Florida didn't look like that at that point. Bottle of whiskey. On election night, Hayes was losing so badly that he prepared this concession speech before turning in for the night. His party chairman went to bed with a bottle of whiskey. We soon fell into refreshing sleep, Hayes later wrote in his diary about the events of November 7th, 1876. The affair seemed over. Well, it wasn't. And if you notice what's there, that's a gun. And in one of these cartoons, Tilden or Blood. It wasn't over. Ain't over until it's over, right? Wasn't over at all. Both sides declared victory. No clear winner. 82% of the eligible voters came out to vote. In a normal election, if you get more than 50%, up towards 60%, that's considered great. 1876, 82% came out. Republicans and Democrats rushed to Florida. Does that sound familiar? Rushing to Florida like hanging chads in Palm Beach County in 2000, Gore against Bush? Louisiana and South Carolina to watch and try to influence the counting of votes. The returning boards determined which votes to count and which ones to throw out if they were fraudulent. Colorado was also an interesting place. I was in Colorado in 1996, And the temperature in Colorado at that time was about 100 degrees where I was. Colorado officially became a state in August. Had it not become a state, Tilden would have won. But when the state legislature ended up choosing electors who voted for Hayes, it was soon discovered that those electors were more biased for Hayes than Tilden. Those electoral votes suddenly became important. So how do you go about deciding election? You don't know who won. You don't even know which side really won. How do you go about deciding an election? Well, you can take it to court, I suppose. The returning boards in all three states, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, argued that fraud, intimidation, and violence in certain districts invalidated votes, and they threw out enough Democratic votes for Hayes to win. All three returning boards awarded their state's electoral votes to Hayes. Oregon, this a few years ago in Portland. Keep Portland weird. And this is really weird what goes on in Oregon. In Oregon, a strange development added that state into the uncertain mix. Hayes won the state, but one of the Republican electors, John W. Watts, was also postmaster. And the U.S. Constitution forbids federal office holders from being electors. Watts planned to resign from his position in order to be a Republican elector, but the governor of Oregon, who was a Democrat, disqualified Watts and instead certified a Tilden elector. Fake electors. I want to show you something about this picture. This picture is from 2019. It's Mardi Gras in New Orleans. And on top of this used to be Robert E. Lee. That's a statue that was taken down. And I'm going to get to when these statues went up. But that's New Orleans, and that is a column holding up nothing at this point. But it was, at one point, Robert E. Lee, who, of course, was a general in the Civil War. Electors cast their ballots in state capitals on December 6, 1876. Generally, the process went smoothly, except in 4 states. In Salem, Oregon, Columbia, South Carolina, Tallahassee, Florida, and New Orleans, Louisiana. Fake electors suddenly show up. 2 sets of conflicting electors met and voted so that the U.S. Congress received 2 sets of conflicting electoral votes. They were fake electors in 1876.
How could they be electors?
Well, they said they were. It's happened in Michigan in 2020 as well. At this point, Tilden had 184 electoral votes, while Hayes had 165, and there are still 20 votes being disputed. The Constitution stipulates that the electoral votes be directed to the President of the Senate, who was the Republican Thomas W. Ferry. The President of the Senate now is the Vice President of the United States. 2020, the guy who was supposed to count the electoral votes was Mike Pence, Donald Trump's vice president. Although Republicans argued that they had the right to decide which votes to count, Democrats disagreed and argued that the Democratic majority in Congress should decide. Just a decade after the Civil War, Union and Confederate veterans were upset. And they're saying, you know what? Maybe we should restart the Civil War. Maybe we really didn't get an answer in 1865. Maybe it's time to start shooting people. Someone fired a bullet through the window of Rutherford B. Hayes' home. The incident was covered up. The Republicans despised the thought that the rebels, the Confederates, would be in control of the government and a second Civil War was near. How many of you knew about this? The second Civil War possible? They never taught us this in the textbooks. Just skimmed over Hayes. So there is what would become the Compromise of 1877, which was not named the Compromise of 1877 until a historian did it about 70 years later. Compromise was reached on January 29, 1877. The Electoral Commission established a commission of 5 senators, 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats, 5 representatives, 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 5 Supreme Court justices, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 1 independent to decide which votes to count and resolve the dispute. However, the independent Supreme Court justice refused to serve on the commission and was replaced by a Republican justice, which gave the Republicans an 8-7 advantage. Gee, what do you think happened after that? What do you think happened? There is Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes didn't support the commission initially, but he changed his mind because it would enhance the legitimacy of the eventual winner. The commission voted on straight party line, 8-7. Hayes is getting the votes in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, and also the one from Oregon. All of a sudden, the fix is in. Hayes gets it. It is not 7-7-1, it's 8-7. Democratic members of Congress threatened to prevent the count of the electoral votes and delay the resolution of the election with frequent adjournments and filibusters. With the threat of the delay, Democrats had hoped to win some concessions from the Republicans. Wasn't there, like in 2021, when they counted the votes, didn't they want a delay on January 6th? The Compromise of 1877. It wasn't the compromise, the Republicans had the numbers. Here's the irony. There's an absolute irony in this. The Republicans and Democrats met on February 26, 1877. A small bipartisan group met in Washington's Wormley Hotel. I'll get into Wormley in a minute. They discussed the potential deal in which the Democrats would accept Hayes as president in exchange for support for a Southern Transcontinental Railroad and the end of Reconstruction. The Southerners felt that if they had a railroad, it would bring money in. But no decisive agreement was reached. And here's the irony of the Wormley Hotel. Did you ever hear of this guy, Wormley?
No.
Interesting story. James Wormley was the owner and operator of the Wormley Hotel, which opened in Washington, D.C. in 1869. Wormley was born a free black citizen in 1819 in Washington. So at the hotel, where Reconstruction definitely ends and Jim Crow is ushered in, they meet at a hotel owned by an African American. You couldn't, if you gave this script to a Hollywood studio, they would say, no way. But it was true. And there he is, James Wormley. He rose to own the most important hotel in Washington. That was the hotel that everybody went to if they were a diplomat. And all the important people in Washington ended up at the Wormley Hotel. He was the richest African American in Washington, and the hotel became a hub for local and foreign government officials. The hotel was the site of the Wormley Agreement, which led to the Compromise of 1877 and the election of President Rutherford B. Hayes. The end of the Reconstruction took place at an African man's hotel. Go figure that one out. Go figure that one out. So it's over. It's done. Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the President of the United States, the stolen election of 1876. Samuel J. Tilden decided, I'm not really going to fight this. I live comfortably at home. I live next to John Wilkes Brothers' place down around Union Square. And one of my press clubs uses Edwin Booth's place as a meeting place for lunch, and next door is Tilden's home. Hayes started talking to politicians. Hayes' ability to convince his opponents that they could tolerate 4 years of his presidency made it possible for them to concede his victory. And there is Hayes. Well, he has that 1 vote edge. He's got what he needs, 1 vote. And that mattered more than Tilden getting nearly 51% of the popular vote. Though the Democrats were furious, all Tilden could do was shrug. It's about what I expected. I'm going back home. Two issues interested Democrats: restoring control of local governments and white supremacy in the South, removing the last of the federal troops, and a federal subsidy for railroads. It is doubtful that Hayes, his supporters, and the Democrats really reached any sort of deal beyond what Hayes promised to do in his letter of acceptance, which was to pull the troops out, but Grant had started pulling the troops out. Samuel J. Randall, the Democratic Speaker of the House, realizing that creating chaos would backfire on the Democrats, finally ruled the filibusters out of order and forced the completion of the count in the early hours of March 2nd, 1877. With 185 votes to Tilden's 184, Hayes was declared winner 2 days before he was inaugurated. He was never really inaugurated before a crowd. So it's the compromise of 1877, and I'll read you this. Mrs. U.S., thanks Mr. Tilden. I promised to dance the set with Mr. Hayes. Rejected on the floor. Democrats agreed that Hayes would become president in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South and granting of home rule in the South. Hayes' withdrawal of the federal troops from Louisiana and South Carolina marked a major turning point in American political history, effectively ending the Reconstruction era and issuing in the system of Jim Crow. Southern Democrats' promises to protect civil and political rights of blacks were not kept, and the end of federal interference in Southern affairs led to widespread disenfranchisement of black voters. Troops were removed from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. But most federal troops were gone. Grant pulled them out. So Rutherford B. Hayes got a couple new names: Rutherford, or his fraudulency. That's what he was called after he took office. Hayes had hoped to reconcile the divisions left over from the Civil War and Reconstruction, and it's likely that he generally wanted to protect the civil rights of African Americans. He failed. His removal of federal troops emboldened white supremacists in the South. Now, you can't see this all that clearly, but I'm going to tell you what this is. Stone Mountain, Georgia. I don't know if anybody has ever been to Stone Mountain, Georgia. You have. Okay, so you've seen the carving, which includes Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson carved into one of the hills in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Stone Mountain, Georgia is an interesting place. It's a minority-majority population. And you see people enjoying themselves in Stone Mountain, and yet this is a monument to the Confederacy. Now, there has been some talk that on the other side of this carving, they should be putting up some people like Martin Luther King Jr. and others, Julian Bond, who I interviewed back in 1978, one of my first interviews at the age of 21. Put them there, next to it, balance it out a little bit. Stone Mountain, Georgia. During the 1890s, Confederate General Robert E. Lee and Confederate memorials became much more public symbols of what was called the Lost Cause history. A new generation of white Southerners were determined to celebrate the cause of their parents. They lost. Their country lost. Their country lasted a little more than 3 years. Nobody goes around celebrating, hey, we're a country for 3 years. Look at us, we lost. They did. Maintained a distinctive Southern cultural identity. In the early 20th century, Southern white women were the strongest voice in perpetuating lost cause memory. And here's a little better picture, and you can see, without me in there, you can see the carving here. I took my zoom lens, and here they are. Lee, Jackson, and Jefferson Davis. You know, in Arlington, Virginia, the main thoroughfare in Arlington, Virginia, which leads right into Washington, D.C., is Jefferson Davis Highway. I worked with a company, Mutual Radio, Jefferson Davis Highway. Several former Confederate states established Robert E. Lee Day to celebrate his birthday. He lost. Note, he's a losing general. Museums dedicated to Confederate history were created in Columbia, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia. The most profound change came in the form of hundreds of public monuments to the Confederate dead. Well, they're heroes. They lost. They lost. In 1883, the Supreme Court ruled in the civil rights cases that public accommodation sections of the Act were unconstitutional, saying Congress was not afforded control over private persons or corporations under the Equal Protection Clause. Well, Jim Crow took a long time, an awful long time, to finally get the attention of people of the caste system in the South. And television has a lot to do with that. The aftermath of the 1876 election, Supreme Court helped undermine the Constitution protections of black people with the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson 1896 case, which legitimized Jim Crow laws and the Jim Crow way of life. Poll tax. Poll tax. You want to vote? You got to pay a tax. In effect till 1964. In effect till 1964. Money to vote. Not long ago, citizens in certain states had to pay a fee to vote in the national election. The fee, called the poll tax. On January 23rd, 1964, the United States ratified the 24th Amendment to the Constitution prohibiting any poll tax in elections for federal officials. This is Indianapolis. I was in Indianapolis. I'm just walking around killing time in Indianapolis, and I spotted this sign near the hotel I was staying at. The Indianapolis Times, begun as the Indianapolis Sun in 1878, was published here from 1924 until it ceased publication October 11th, 1965. The Times won journalism's highest award, the Pulitzer Prize, in 1928 for exposing the Ku Klux Klan. They're up in Indiana. At the turn of the 20th century, the Ku Klux Klan experienced a major revival in the United States, along with the Confederate statues. By the early 1920s, nationwide membership reached over 2 million. The Birth of the Nation, remember The Birth of the Nation, the movie? Was originally called The Klansman. It has been called the most controversial film ever made in the United States and the most reprehensible racist film in Hollywood history. The Birth of the Nation racially charged Jim Crow narrative coupled with Americans' heightened anti-immigration climate. By 1924, this movie came out in the 19-teens. By 1924, there was the Reed-Johnson Immigration Act. And that Immigration Act basically went after those people from Eastern Europe that kept coming over and over and over and over again. And it went back to 1890 census to see the percentage of immigrants coming to the United States. Well, if they would have waited 3 or 4 more years, it would have been changed. They went after the Jewish population to put a quota up to keep the Jews out of the United States. And also throw in Italians and Greeks, because it was all about Eastern Europe. Anyway, The Birth of the Nation led the Klan to align itself with the movie's success and use it as a recruiting tool. It was the first motion picture to be screened inside the White House, viewed there by President Woodrow Wilson, his family, and members of his cabinet. Woodrow Wilson was a racist, and they're taking down his name at Princeton University. He was the president of Princeton University because of his actions. He basically got rid of as many blacks as he could in the federal government. Jim Crow, colored water fountain. By the way, before Penn Station closed in Manhattan, 1963, they had separate water fountains. Colored water fountains, white water fountains. Jim Crow was the name of the racial caste system, which operated primarily, but not exclusively, in the South and border states between 1877 and the mid-1960s. Jim Crow was, it was a series of rigid anti-black laws. It was a way of life. Under Jim Crow, African Americans were relegated to the status of second-class citizens. Jim Crow represented the legitimization of anti-black racism. In the South, you'd see this all over the place. The colored entrance. They didn't want you, if you were African American, to come in the front door. If they allowed you in, it had to be through the back door. White people were superior to black people in all important ways, including but not limited to intelligence, morality, and civil behavior. Sexual relations between black and white people, except if you're Strom Thurmond, would produce a mongrel race which would destroy America. Also Thomas Jefferson. Treating black people as equals would encourage interracial sexual unions. Any activity which suggested social equality encouraged interracial sexual relations. If necessary, violence must be used to keep black people at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. That would continue into the 1950s. The Little Rock Nine in 1957, when Dwight Eisenhower declared war against an American city, Little Rock, Arkansas. The Little Rock Nine. In Little Rock, Arkansas, a group of 9 black students enrolled at the formerly all-white Central High School on September 4th, 1957. The governor, Orville Farbus, called in the Arkansas National Guard to block the black students' entry into the high school. Later that month, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was really against the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling, which said that blacks were entitled to an equal education to whites, finally gets off his hands and starts getting involved in the civil rights movement. He sends federal troops to escort the Little Rock Nine into the school. First time Eisenhower reacted to the new civil rights era. And there, some of the students, Little Rock Nine. The Arkansas NAACP picked them. They all possessed the strength and determination to face the resistance they would encounter. In the weeks prior to the start of the new school year, the students participated in intense counseling sessions, guiding them on what to expect once classes began and how to respond to anticipated hostile situations. And Ike sends in the military, the 101 1st Division, 101 1st Airborne Division. Back on March 17, 1954, in the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka case, the United States Supreme Court ruled unanimously, 9-0, that racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibits the states from denying equal protection of laws to any person within their jurisdiction. The decision declared that separate educational facilities for white and African American students were inherently unequal. 9 African American students arrived on the second day of school, accompanied by an interracial group of ministers. They encountered a large white mob in front of the school who began shouting, throwing stones, and threatening to kill the students. In addition, about 270 soldiers of the Arkansas National Guard, sent in by Farbus, blocked the school's entrance. President Dwight Eisenhower, Governor Farbus, and Little Rock Mayor Woodrow Mann discussed the situation over the course of 18 days, during which the 9 students stayed home. Students returned to the high school on September 23rd, entering through a side door to avoid the protesters' attention and wrath. And this is how they went to school. How would you have liked to have gone to school like this? Soldiers with bayonets protecting you. How'd you like that? The students were sent home. They returned on September 25th, protected by the U.S. soldiers. Despite Eisenhower's publicly stated reluctance to use federal troops to enforce desegregation, he recognized the potential for violence and state insubordination. He thus sent the elite 101st Airborne Division, called the Screaming Eagles, to Little Rock and placed the Arkansas National Guard under federal command. This would change things. How many of you had a TV that looked like that? Had a TV that looked like that, right? Now you got flat screen TVs. In 1950, just 9% of American homes had television sets. figure had leapt to 78% in 1957. Television could also broadcast from remote locations, not just the studio. John Chancellor, reporter for the National Broadcasting Company, or NBC, was there. With others, they covered the story. The cameras caught what was going on. TV began to show the stories of Jim Crow. That's it. These are the, in newspapers, and you got to see this on TV every day. In September 1957, people gathered around their TV sets watching the news from Little Rock. What they saw was disturbing. Angry mobs of whites assaulting 9 black students. In October, TV cameras were back and showed the same black children entering the same school under the protection of the elite U.S. Army paratroopers. America could not hide anymore. Images became powerful. One clip features several African-American female students exiting a station wagon, walking between police toward the high school. A group of white students is seen walking through the doors of the school and down the front steps. Next, the crowd stands around the tree where an effigy of an African-American is hung from one of the branches. Boys tear down the effigy, light it on fire. A military police officer takes the effigy down and tries to put out the fire by stomping on it. The Cold War imagery. America's in the middle of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, trying to prove they are much better than the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower knows this. At a time when we face grave situations abroad because of the hatred that communists bears towards a system of government based on human rights, it would be difficult to exaggerate the harm that is being done to the prestige and influence, and indeed to the safety of our nation and the world. America is at war with itself. Time magazine. Our enemies are gloating over this incident and using it everywhere to misrepresent our whole nation. We are portrayed as a violator of those standards of conduct which the people of the world unite to proclaim in the Charter of the United Nations. There they affirm faith in fundamental human rights and in the dignity and worth of a human person. And they did so without distinction to race, sex, language, or religion. Well, they came back in 1997, the 9 students. It was the 40th reunion. The Little Rock 9 faced physical and verbal abuse. Minnie Jean Brown fought back and was expelled. The remaining 8 students attended the school for the rest of the year. 1958, the senior, Ernest Green, became the first African-American to graduate from Little Rock Central High School. Push for civil rights, there I am again with John Thurman another time. He tried to prevent it, even though he had an African-American family. He tried to hold up the 1957 civil rights legislation with a filibuster of 24 hours and 18 minutes. He was opposing the Civil Rights Act of 1957. He also later opposed ending segregation. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was the first federal civil rights legislation passed by the U.S. Congress since the Civil Rights Act of 1875. There were 2 classes of people in 1957. This is the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, which is a civil rights museum as well. Go figure, it's Henry Ford. Henry Ford, the anti-Semite, who Hitler called his hero. The Civil Rights Act 1957, protection of voters' rights set out in the 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice, empowering federal prosecutors to obtain court injunctions against interference with the right to vote. Civil Rights Commission within the executive branch with the authority to investigate discriminatory conditions to recommend corrective measures. 1964, Lyndon Johnson would sign the Civil Rights Act into law, and there he is doing that. That was in July of 1964. And that barred unequal application of voter registration requirements, outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin in hotels, motels, restaurants, theaters, and other public accommodations. prohibited states and municipalities from denying access to public facilities on the grounds of race, color, religion, or national origin. Encouraged discrimination of desegregation rather. Encouraged desegregation of public schools, authorized the U.S. Attorney General to file suits enforcing the law, or the act. Expanded the Civil Rights Commission established by the Civil Rights Act of 1957, prevented discrimination by government agencies that receive federal funds. Prevented discrimination by government agencies that receive federal funds. Expanded the Civil Rights Commission established by the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Prevented discrimination by government agencies that receive federal funds. And there's the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. He called the Civil Rights Act of 1964 nothing less than the second emancipation. The Voters' Rights Act of 1965, there was King and there was Johnson. Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law August 6, 1965. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders were present at the ceremony. Outlawed discriminatory voting practices adopted in many southern states after the Civil War, including literacy tests as a prerequisite to voting. But in 2013, the Supreme Court, 5-4, said the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional. Kennedy, Roberts, Alito, Scalia, Thomas, Kagan, Sotomayor, Breyer, Ginsburg. These people serve too long on the Supreme Court. There should be term limits on them. In 2013, the Supreme Court's 5-member conservative majority gutted the Voters' Rights Act by ruling that states with a long history of racial discrimination in their conduct of elections no longer needed to clear changes to voting laws with federal government, holding up things that have dramatically changed, since the act was passed in 1965. Right after that, southern states started passing laws to make it more difficult to vote. Well, what about Rutherford B. Hayes in the aftermath? What happened to Rutherford B. Hayes? How many of you know anything about Rutherford B. Hayes? Nobody. Nobody. Well, he has some importance. He's little remembered today in the United States, but he's a national hero in Paraguay. Do you know that? He's a national hero in Paraguay. Hayes agreed to negotiate a long border dispute between Argentina and Paraguay, and the decision gave Paraguay 60% of its land. In Paraguay, there's a state called Presidente Hayes. The region celebrates Presidente Hayes Day on November 12th annually, and even has a soccer team that's been named after Rutherford B. Hayes. Meanwhile, how many of you have used the New York Public Library on 42nd Street? You know, that psychic has been there forever. How do psychics make money? How do they make money? Have you ever seen a psychic go out of business? No. No. And by the way, I'll give you a story. How many of you remember the Amazing Kreskin? Remember him? Amazing. He knew everything, right? He could see into the future. Well, back in 1976, I was going out with a woman who lived in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And her father was the head of the Internal Revenue Service office in Philadelphia. And he's looking, and he sees Kreskin's name on there. And he says, I'm going to take this case. And he told me the story, this guy, Irv. And he said, Kreskin comes in. And the first question Irv asks the Amazing Kreskin is, well, you're the seer. You can see into the future. Why are you here? He says, I really don't know. Can you please tell me? A psychic. Anyway, behind there is the New York Public Library. Tilden accepted the defeat. I can retire to public life with the consciousness that I shall receive from the posterity the credit of having been elected to the highest position in the gift of the people without any of the cares and responsibilities of the office. In 1866, Samuel J. Tilden, upon his death, bequeathed the bulk of his fortune, which was about $2.4 million. Multiply that by about 30 now, so it's over $60 million, to be used to establish and maintain a free library and reading room in the city of New York. He is one of the people responsible for the New York Public Library, and of course there is a high school in New York named the Samuel J. Tilden High School. Thank you very much. And oh, by the way, next to the library is a statue of Gertrude Stein, the library of Bryant Park. Gertrude Stein once said of Oakland, California, there is no there there. Anyway, thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? It is your turn to talk. So how many of you knew of Rutherford B. Hayes?